Hello and welcome to the Stories of Northern Life by the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. If you're new to the podcast, I'm Mari Morsuit, the Design and Engagement Lead here at the Sault Museum. If you come by at 690 Queen Street East, you'll probably find me in the front office, and I would love to chat with you about Sault Ste. Marie stories. But today I'm going to share with you a story we came across in the collection. I assume that most of us have been to the Canal District here in the Soo. Right in front of the Algoma Conservatory, or the Loft, there is a little sunken ground where you will find a hidden piece of history. It is still fairly hidden to this day until you walk over and look down at it, but it was actually covered up for years until Clergue did some research and some investigation. I'll be reading directly from an article that was published in the Soo Star, July 7, 1922. It directly quotes some of Mr. Clergue's letters. Given the time period, some of the language used is not appropriate in today's world. Keep that in mind as you listen. And let's get into this story. As a result of some inquiries instituted by the Soo Historical Society to secure accurate data for the inscription to be placed on the cairn, which the Canadian National Parks Board intended to erect at the restored lock of the Northwest Fur Company, immediately adjourned in the offices of the Spanish River Pulp and Paper Limited. Mr. F.H. Clergue has written an account of the discovery of the old lock by him in 1896, and the Stone Powder magazine into a blockhouse. The first Sault Ste. Marie Canal was constructed by the Northwest Company in 1797, and was used with a wooden lock for canoes and bateaux before 1802. The building's lock and wharf were destroyed by the U.S. troops in 1814. The fur companies were merged in the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. Mr. Clergue's letter reads, "My present recollections of the specifications relating to this reconstruction are rather vague, but the following is a brief summary. The historical connections of the falls at Sault Ste. Marie with the work of the early discoveries and pioneer explorers excited my interest when I purchased, in 1894, though the town of Sault Ste. Marie from Hudson's Bay Company to the lands controlling the rapids on the Canadian side. After the first purchase I made another purchase through Lord Strathcona and Mr. Chipman, the commissioner of the company in Winnipeg. When we came into possession of the lands, I tracked down by word of mouth Indian sites on the American and Canadian side, such local legends and rehearsals of authentic history as were available. I found that Judge Steerer, then a local judge at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, who felt an interest in the early history of the region, had some test pits dug in the vicinity of the rapids on the Canadian side in search of the location of an old lock, which it was rumored the Hudson Bay Company had constructed in the Canadian rapids for the purpose of facilitating the passage of large Canadian bateaux, in which the supplies of the Hudson's Bay Company were in the early days transported from Montreal up the Ottawa River and portaged into the French River, thence into Georgian Bay and over the Soo Rapids to Michipicoten, and to their other posts on the lake. The bateaux were said to be 30 to 40 feet in length, and from 6 to 8 feet in width, and to draw about 2 feet of water when loaded. I examined the remains of one of those bateaux, which was in a sufficient state of preservation to clearly distinguish all of its parts, and which had been hauled out at the post at Michipicoten, when I was engaged in constructing the Algoma Central Railway and developing the Helen Mine. The old factor of the Hudson's Bay Company at Sault Ste. Marie, whom I took to Michipicoten, told me that this was a veritable example of the standard type of bateau originally used in the Montreal Lake Superior traffic. Before our improvements in the rapids had progressed very far, and the original surface had been concealed by the deposit of waste material from our works and canals, I traced from the Lake Huron and the Lake Superior level the different brooks or watercourses, which at that time divided the Canadian side into a number of islands, large and small. One of the three brooks had its outlet at Lake Huron level, neat the spot where the loch was sequentially divorced, and near which there was then standing an old frame building, which was the grist mill. There was not a race of any such structure as a loch, but in their watercourse, which started near the spot where the loch has finally uncovered, and ascended in a circuitous way, ultimately entering the Lake Superior level not far from where the Algoma Central Railway now passes beneath the Canadian Pacific Railway. I found at various points cross stills laid in the rock and mud, apparently composed of round oak logs, the top surface of which was scarred, evidently from the dragging of boats over these timbers. These timbers were not laid with any regularity for the purpose of casting the bare bottoms away from the rough ledge. These timbers led us to the uncovering of the final location of the loch, which had been filled in the natural deposit of earth and rocks from the watercourse. The flowing water was dammed inside. At about 8 feet of excavation, some of the bottom timbers of the old loch were discovered, and with careful exploration, the entire framework and bottom were found in the original position. But the timber sides and ends had fallen in together with the general debris. The outline of the loch was clearly defined. The floor made of oak logs, spliced and doweled, and the oak cross still underneath were found to be in quite sound condition. I instructed that the loch be restored as nearly as we could devise, according to its probably original form, and made permanent by the erection of stone walls and miniature head and fall gates, and that wholly restored loch enclosed with an iron fence to prevent intrusion. I had a water pipe laid into the loch and an overflow provided that the flowing water would permit for living fish. The loch is now practically in the same condition as it was restored in about the year 1896. I gave particular instructions that the original oak timbers be left in position, and that only such additional flooring timbers should be placed as might be necessary for the permanent preservation of the whole. We found the original outlines of the loch had been about 40 feet in length, 8 feet in width, with the total lift apparently being not over 10 feet. The stream leading into the loch was evidently sufficient deep to allow the dragging of loaded canoes over the remaining 10 or 12 feet of elevation, with the assistance of the round oak stills embedded across the rougher spots. I think the above conveys practically all the information you require except the year in which the work was done. And I am sending a copy of this letter to Mr. B.J. Clergue without awaiting his return to ask his advice as to how we can authentically fix the exact year in which restoration was completed. My impression is that it was within the period of 1896 and 1898. You have also asked me to supply the exact date when the blockhouse was put in its present condition. I have not had the opportunity to find this record, but I believe that Mr. B.J. Clergue can ascertain it from our files, which have for a long time been in his care. As you will remember, the only really historical part of this blockhouse is a lower stone story. When I acquired this property, it was surrounded by a low heap of big boulders, and between these boulders protruded here and there the stumps of the original post stockade, which surrounded the factory. These boulders were placed about the base of the post because the ledge was too near the surface to permit the driving the post to any depth into the soil. In the main and lower course of the stone forming the present blockhouse was comprised of older original boulders, as I found them, supporting the stumps of the stockade, and on the top of these boulders, I constructed the wall which you see there now. The stone powder magazine comprised only one round and was lighted only to be small loopholes about 6-inch squares, shoulder high, evidently providing for gun barrels. The stone building was surmounted by roof covered with sheet iron, but across the whole top of the stone building was a flat floor constructed wall to wall, covered first with flat stone and then with about 2 feet of clay. From the floor extended the iron roof. I divided the room into 2 by a brick wall and provided the kitchen arrangements in the inner room this formed and a small reception room in the front part. The small iron door I replaced with the larger one of oak and pierced the stone wall for the windows, which are now there, but several of the loopholes were preserved in their original location, in shape simply being blocked with wooden shutters. I sent out into the nearby woods and cut down cedar trees of a size and length suitable for covering the stone building, with a substantial floor with sufficiently strong to support the overhanging structure of cedar logs, which provided the proper architectural style of the blockhouse of period of the Indian Wars, and on the second story this formed. I laid out the living rooms as they are now. This blockhouse, therefore, is not in reality a restoration of any historic monument. We simply preserved the original powder magazine of the Northwest Company and embellished it with the additions which I have described. But, of course, as everybody knows, this is clearly identified headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company on the Sioux River, and the present stone wall exactly defines the identical location of the original post stockade. If anybody, if sufficiently interested to demolish a part of the stone wall at the angle pointing to the building office, the stumps of the original post still be found there if any be sufficiently curious to verify the foundation of the original lock. It will only be necessary to draw the water off and take up the original floor, whereas I have said, will be found the original planking, and my recollection is that each of the stills is still there, as they were planted more than 100 years ago. Well, I hope you learned a little something new about Sault Ste. Marie history today. I hope the next time you're around the Canal District, you take a moment to walk up to the old lock right in the front of the Algoma Conservatory or the Loft building, the first building closest to the road, right next to the gelato mill and Starbucks. I put together a small map on our social media accounts to guide you to the spot. Also a few photos of the locks and the blockhouse and powder magazine. Also check out the Ermitinger Clergue historic site to visit the old blockhouse and learn more about Clergue. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week. Ciao!